Charlotte told me that I have to deliver this sitting, so that's why I didn't stand to acknowledge your kind applause. I've also done something that I don't usually do, given the fact that I had a slight interruption in my schedule recently, which I'll tell you about. I've actually written out some stuff which I'll read, but I'll try to read it in such a way that you won't immediately pass out or doze, whichever comes first. A funny thing happened to me on the way to the Yale Club. On October 5th, I had quintuple bypass surgery. That's okay, though, because it reminded me that, though Korzybski formulated the first non-Aristotelian multi-valued system, he also emphasized that there are in life lower-order situations which demand either-or choices. Either life, high probability, or death, very high probability. An angioplasty procedure indicated that all major heart arteries were so occluded that open heart surgery was required post-haste. The surgeon who interviewed me, I was supine at the time, said that he and his colleagues have achieved a 95% success rate in performing open heart surgery. The alternative for me was almost immediate death, or coagulation, as Korzybski would say. I said, give me the paper, and signed the authorization form. After all, I had to get to the Yale Club. And the surgery having been performed the next day, here I am. But I only did it for y'all. Our theme today is the planetary impact of Korzybski and general semantics as seen from the vantage point of 79 years since the publication of Manhood of Humanity, which has been translated into Italian as the Adulthood of Humanity. I mentioned that for my feminist daughters and nieces. 67 years since the publication of Science and Sanity, 62 years since the founding of the Institute, 50 years since Korzybski's death, and an indication of my personal involvement, 40 years since I began my study and teaching of this discipline. When Korzybski founded and incorporated the Institute of General Semantics in Chicago in 1938, these brief statements appeared in the Articles of Incorporation, setting out the mission of the Institute, which means us. And for most people here who are not simply guests, most people here are members of the Institute. Indeed, this is billed as the annual meeting of the Institute. Then I have here a French expression, which I think is correct, l'Institut c'est nous. Now, I'm going to read some of these statements from the bylaws to give you an indication of what Korzybski was up to, why he exerted himself to do what he did, and why we people who are members of the Institute and teachers and so forth do what we do. The name of said corporation shall be Institute of General Semantics, Incorporated. Seems redundant, doesn't it? The purpose for which said corporation is formed are the following, to wit: in general, to promote and conduct linguistic, epistemologic, scientific research and education. 2, to undertake and conduct education and training courses in the methodology of general semantics. 3, to write, edit, publish, and sell books, pamphlets, periodicals, bulletins, reports, yearbooks, and news releases. 4, to provide teaching and other materials and editorial, consultative, research, teaching, and lecture services on general semantics and allied subjects. 5, to provide encouragement to and supervision of individuals, groups, organizations, and institutions affiliated with the Institute of General Semantics, Incorporated. Okay, so that's basically the mission statement, and it's the kind of stuff that we still are trying to do as participants in the Institute of General Semantics. There's note 1. Now, I note that, as I've often reminded members of the Board of Trustees, that the Institute is neither in the salvation business nor the entertainment business. Our mission is much more modest: the amelioration of human woe by way of improved evaluation. I have a note here to make a reference to my dear friend Harry Maynard. Oftentimes at board meetings, he will complain that, well, we didn't have enough people enrolled for a seminar, that we should really have larger crowds for what we do. And I've said to him, Harry, suppose you had 50,000 general semanticists in a stadium. What in the hell would you do with them? Okay. And of course, the answer is, short of having a revival meeting or something, nothing. Our work is more subtle, much more quiet than the kind of stuff that can happen in a stadium filled with 50,000 flag-waving, stomping, jumping up and down, let's call them affiliates. From the first issue of the General Semantics Bulletins in 1950, its masthead has read, "For information and intercommunication in the non-Aristotelian discipline formulated by Alfred Korzybski. News, views, comments, group activities, work in progress reports, research and applications, etc." The bulletin remains the main engine which drives the ongoing printed dissemination and influence of Korzybski's work in the year 2000. Now, in saying that, I do not want to downplay the importance of etc., the other major journal that deals explicitly with general semantics, published by the International Society of General Semantics in Concord, California, in which I indeed have published many things. Some of you have, Alan Walker Reed has. But the bulletin tends to be more rigorous, generally, and more specifically Korzybskian. So that's why I make that statement. Now, both of these missions, following Korzybski's heroic solo efforts from 1921 to 1933, have been carried forward and continue to this day. What difference has all this effort made? In his Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture of November 11, 1988, right here at the Yale Club, famed psychologist and student of thinking as time-minded, Jerome Bruner, began with this extended statement. And before I read that extended statement, I'll have a little sip of water, with your permission. This is Bruner speaking. I'm very moved to be here. I should introduce this lecture by greeting you all, members of the Institute of General Semantics, and also greeting former colleagues, former students, because there are some of you in that category in the audience. It's very moving. Korzybski is an astonishing figure. He has had an impact very, very difficult fully to grasp, but to put it into some sort of intellectual tradition I've tried to think through where he fits in Western thought. The best I can do is this. There was for a long time, and indeed it still exists today, in Russian and East European linguistics, a strong trend that went under the name of poetics. The objective was to find out what it is that language can do to save people from responding automatically to language. I'm going to repeat that because I think that's a good characterization of what we presume to be up to, as I have read. What is it that language can do, that is to say, we using language, to save people from responding automatically to language? That is to say, if I may take a very striking example of Shklovsky and the Russian formalists, they posed the conception that they spoke of as ostranyanyi. Ostranyanyi refers to how you make the obvious and the familiar strange, so that you look at it afresh. And they saw one of the uses that they spoke of as a poetic function of language, of the literaturnos, of poetry, and the novel, and indeed any kind of writing as an invitation to the speaker to awake to what he was saying or hearing. Again, I will presume to repeat Bruner's words. An invitation to the speaker to awake to what he was saying or hearing. Now, Bruner's an old dude by now, so he says he, but he means humanity in general. My daughters all understand that. I've explained it to them. Or bemused is more like it. Maybe you're annoyed. Now this tradition, this is Bruner again, goes back a long and interesting way to one of the really legendary figures at the turn of the century in linguistics, a Pole about whom Krzyzewski knew, whom everybody knew in linguistics at that point, with the astonishingly French name, as some Poles had at that time. He was called Baudouin de Courtenay. Baudouin de Courtenay came from Warsaw and Częstochowa to the University of Leningrad to lecture, and was one of the first to recognize the importance of the way in which language, as we say today, is constitutive as well as communicative. That is to say, it not only communicates a picture of reality, but actually constitutes it or constructs it. And of course, this is central to Krzyzewski's approach. Now, Baudouin de Courtenay, coming from Warsaw, the Poland that Krzyzewski had been exposed to, had a very long reach. He influenced the poets of the next generation. He influenced people like Roman Jakobson, one of the great giants of the field. Even unto today, the professor of linguistics at the University of Moscow, Professor Ivanov, still represents that tradition. So as I look out at this group this evening and see what the Institute of General Semantics has done, in a sense it has carried, so to say, the plea for consciousness and against automaticity, machine-likeness, robotry, and sees the instrument of language as doing it. So it is indeed for me a great honor to be the 37th, I believe it is, lecturer in this series. Do I, me, need to say that it's a great honor for me to be the 49th lecturer in this series? I hereby do so. Another internationally known scholar who is today considered a classic in semiotics, Charles Morris, characterized Krzyzewski's focus in this way. The work of A. Krzyzewski and his followers is psychobiological in orientation, aiming to protect the individual against exploitation by others and, I emphasize, by himself. Him/herself. Yours. Again, I will presume to repeat that. aiming to protect the individual against exploitation by others and by himself through language. It's important to recognize as a kind of a corollary to this that we do talk first to ourselves. And how we do that makes a big difference in our lives and the lives of others. How we talk to others is very directly a function of how we first talk to ourselves. So getting some consciousness, some awareness of what in hell are we doing in here constantly. You know, we're supposed to do X, but we forget to do it because we're so busy whirling around A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K in our heads that we can very readily lose contact with what we call in general semantics the extensional world. The world in which we, if we're lucky, wake up and smell the coffee. Those statements by Bruner and Morris well characterize Korzybski's program and give a strong indication of his impact in the just ended 20th century. From the very beginning of his career in America, Korzybski had impact, if only because he was one of those fascinating characters, quite like the great conductor Leopold Stokowski, who attract attention from the daily press, both mainstream and tabloid, and journals across the spectrum, from the New Republic, various professional periodicals, scientific, medical, educational, and psychiatric, to Masonic magazines like The Builder, popular magazines like Liberty, Time, Life, and Quip, and a host of others. Now, some of you I know, are young enough that you may not recall that there was a magazine called Liberty, which my father refused to let me sell, by the way. I mean, I wanted to work. I needed some pennies. And I wanted to sell Liberty magazine, carrying it around in a bag, you know, with Liberty on the canvas bag, and going through the neighborhood trying to peddle this magazine. Well, my father considered that undignified behavior and refused to let me do it. See, and it's very important because that's why I grew up to be so dignified. But time in life, I suppose, everybody will recall, whatever your age. His first book, Manhood of Humanity, The Science and Art of Human Engineering, 1921, created a great stir. By 1923, going into its fourth printing. Scholars, scientists, and philosophers from every continent, save Antarctica, wrote to him wanting to discuss his theories, his definition of humans as time miners, his views on language, labor relations, the role of capital in economic systems, the biological basis of human evaluating, etc., etc. Korzybski was not shy about covering a lot of ground, as you can see. I want to say something, though, about this Antarctica business. In my preface to the 5th edition of Science and Sanity, I wrote that Korzybski is being read and studied in every continent, save perhaps Antarctica. Now, there may be a couple of researchers at Antarctica who have a copy of Science and Sanity with them, but I wasn't sure about that, so I mentioned probably not in Antarctica. Because I know, for example, that penguins do not read. Well, on the internet, somebody objected to that, claiming that I was some kind of elitist. Apparently, he felt offended for the Antarcticans. So, you know, you got to be careful what you put in print. For several years, I have been examining this. Wait a minute. Oh, yeah, so there's a lot of correspondence. For several years, I've been examining this correspondence, news clippings, office memos, etc., in the Korzybski archive in the Butler Library Rare Books and Manuscripts Room at Columbia University. The archive contains an estimated 20,000 items. Krzyzewski was a very busy fellow. I can affirm that he corresponded with the majority of important scientist scholars of the first half of the 20th century. I mention a few here. Bertrand Russell in mathematics, logic, and philosophy. Bronisław Malinowski in anthropology and comparative linguistics. Eric T. Bell in mathematics. C.K. Ogden, linguistics and semantics. C. Judson Herrick, neurology. Percy W. Bridgman, Nobel Prize physicist, and a host of others. Some Krzyzewski knew personally, consulting face-to-face, engaging in reciprocal influence. And I want to emphasize that, reciprocal influence. Krzyzewski was a remarkably open person, even until his old age, which he really didn't achieve. I mean, he was younger than I when he died. And God knows I'm not old. So, but until he suddenly stopped, he was very open to information from others, to learning. He was very taken, for example, in 1948 by Norbert Wiener's term feedback, which he realized that he had been talking about for years, neuro-linguistic feedback, but didn't have that term. So he was just delighted with learning about feedback from Norbert Wiener, and this was when he was about 68 or so years old. So this influence was mutual, as that lovely lady says in Young Frankenstein, mutual. Of special importance were the coterie of pioneers at Johns Hopkins University with whom he consulted in Baltimore, and during informal gatherings at a farm near Arnold, Maryland, which was owned by a friend of Krzyzewski. And he specialized, although he was not a terribly creative formulator himself, he made a specialty of attracting pioneers and originators. And there were a whole bunch at Hopkins at this time. And they would come down from Baltimore to Arnold, Maryland, which is now where the Anne Arundel Community College is located, and which I taught some general semantics, by the way. And they would just spend a weekend, 3 or 4 days, talking to each other. And Krzyzewski was part of that group. So he learned a lot, but he also taught a lot in that process. Some of the people involved were H.S. Jennings in biology, Raymond Pearl, W. Horsley Gott, who was an associate of Pavlov and introduced Pavlovian methods into the United States, and William H. Wilmer of the famous eye clinic. Actually, the eye clinic didn't exist then. It was created and named after Wilmer some years later. One notable person on whom Krzyzewski drew and who knew something of Krzyzewski's work and didn't think much of it was Albert Einstein. According to Blanche Weinberg, wife of Harry Weinberg, a student of Krzyzewski, who wrote the excellent Levels of Knowing and Existence, Studies in General Semantics, she and Harry were boating on Lake Saranac when they spotted Einstein and his sister in a small sailboat. And I have a photograph that Weinberg took of that, and I often tell people, you could still tell which one is Einstein's sister because she has the larger mustache. They look remarkably alike. Harry asked permission to take the photograph, which I just mentioned. He identified himself as a student of Krzyzewski and asked Einstein what he thought of Science and Sanity, at which Einstein said, "That's a crazy book." But I remind you that Einstein, of Einstein's rejection of statistical methods in quantum mechanics and what he called, quote, that Bohr Heisenberg tranquilizing philosophy. So despite his reputation, Einstein wasn't always right. You know? Sometimes he was scared at formulational levels. Earlier this year, I spent time examining the newly founded Krzyzewski archive at the University of Warsaw, a much more modest collection which nevertheless contains many treasures for the biographer and cultural historian, and I'll say more about that later. Current examples of, now, I hope I've given some indication that when Korzybski was alive, he was very much in the news. Many programs were set up in colleges, universities, and in independent institutions teaching his stuff. Within his lifetime, there were three big conferences on general semantics based primarily on the stir that Science and Sanity had initiated. And these were attended by all kinds of scholars from all over the United States and from abroad. Current examples of the impact of Korzybski are related to some people here today. Dr. Rachel Lauer has already been introduced. She's the head of the Strauss Learning and Thinking Center program. Dr. Martin Levinson, who I believe is in the back there. Hello, Marty. Who heads a program working in drug counseling, in which he uses general semantics methodology. Alan Meyerowitz, who's the head of the Artificial Intelligence program at the Naval Research Lab in Washington, D.C., teaches his researchers general semantics as a tool by means of which to conduct their research, as an informing paradigm, as we would say today. And there are many others. Sanford Berman has recently established, what is it, two, I believe, three, the third one has gone through? All right. Three university professorships in general semantics in California. Did the Nevada go through? Okay, good. So the impact is there. Most important has been Korzybski's impact in education. Probably the best source for getting to know about that is a work published in 1958 and originally by Catholic University Press by a Catholic nun named Margaret Gorman, called the educational implications of general semantics, something like that. And that has been published separately as a University of Nebraska Bison book. It's called General Semantics and Contemporary Thomism. Now, of course, Margaret Gorman, being a Catholic nun and raised in the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, was very interested in comparing the very Aristotelian approach of Thomas Aquinas with that of Korzybski in general semantics. And of course, you can guess who won in her book. But she recognizes, and of course, and she bases much of her discussion on Hayakawa, but she makes the statement that since most English teachers in the United States at this time, we're talking about 1958, 1960, are basing their instruction largely on Hayakawa's book, which has sold well over 1 million copies since its original publication, that it's very important to examine this stuff to see what's being taught to the children, the effect on the children, bringing them from being trained to be certaintists to being uncertaintists, et cetera, et cetera. So that's probably the best source that you can look at to get an indication of the impact of Korzybski's. Margaret Gorman, being a Catholic nun and raised in the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, was very interested in comparing the very Aristotelian approach of Thomas Aquinas with that of Korzybski in general semantics. And of course, you can guess who won in her book. But she recognizes, and of course, and she bases much of her discussion on Hayakawa, but she makes the statement that since most English teachers in the United States at this time, we're talking about 1958, 1960, are basing their instruction largely on Hayakawa's book, which has sold well over 1 million copies since its original publication, that it's very important to examine this stuff to see what's being taught to the children, the effect on the children, bringing them from being trained to be certaintists to being uncertaintists, et cetera, et cetera. So that's probably the best source that you can look at to get an indication of the impact of Krzyzewski/Science and Sanity in the United States and ultimately in the world. Now, from this point on, I'm going to get personal, since I've been kind of like Malinowski, the anthropologist, who called himself a participant observer in his fieldwork in the Trobriand Islands and Papua New Guinea and places like that. He was very gifted in languages, as many of his colleagues were from that part of the world. And when he went into the field to study so-called primitive cultures, he didn't just have a house somewhere and then occasionally go and look at people. He lived among them. In every place he went, he learned the language and was able to understand the culture through that language. But he was not of that culture. So that's why he called himself a participant observer. He was participating, but he was still the observer from outside who was going to eventually publish books in England about what he found out. And so I'm going to suggest that when I started studying general semantics, I sort of functioned in that way also. I was interested in two things, learning what the hell is this guy talking about, but also observing how it was being done and so forth. I'll mention my early reaction to this. I had just finished a Jesuit college in which I did very well in Thomistic, that is to say, Aristotelian philosophy. I got A's, if you can believe it. So when I was reading Krzyzewski, my early reactions were, oh, poo, 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 poo. And I admitted to myself that if this guy, and George has mentioned that, if this guy didn't have the name Krzyzewski, I'd probably throw the book into the fire. But I felt obliged because I'm also a student of Polish stuff, culture, etc. So I insisted, I kept reading. And finally, I got the neurolinguistic point in the introduction to the second edition, where Krzyzewski said, philosophers, mathematicians, etc., seem unable to recognize that if a phonograph record has to have its structure changed before it can store information, music, whatever it may be, why is it so hard to understand that the human nervous system works in the same way? That's what I call the neurolinguistic point. And when I saw that and pondered, I said, there's something here. And as I read further, I said to myself, if this guy is right, then almost everybody else that I've read up to this point as well. So, now, I don't claim any kind of a great epiphany. This was just a very clear, unexcited recognition. I didn't pass out or anything like that. So from this point on, I'm going to talk about Krzyzewski's impact through my own experience as someone who decided that I would become a teacher in this field. Before that, though, in fact, before I had even read Krzyzewski, I'd heard about him. And in 1960, a Monsignor at a shore party where we drank beer and talked a lot, a fellow named Javolsky, was putting out a parish newspaper in which he had articles about notable Poles. It was a Polish parish. And the person who had been doing that had run out of gas, and Javolsky asked me, would you take this over? So I said, sure. So I wrote a few, obviously Malinowski, Marie Curie, people like that. But then I had heard about Krzyzewski, first of all, at a party where a young engineering student named Ferd Linefuller from Purdue University, somebody said something, and he said, oh, yeah, Krzyzewski. I heard about that. And that's all I knew. So I decided, since I needed to do another article for this series, I'll look into Krzyzewski. And I did. And here I am today. As Weinberg said, what would he say? I fell for the book, something and thinker. Yeah, the book, line, and thinker. Yeah, he read it, and he fell for the book, line, and thinker. Good old Harry. All right. So I also have consistently run into people I'll be in a restaurant with a party, and somebody from another table knows somebody from the party I'm in, and they might come over, and they say, well, what do you do? And so I tell them, and they have trouble believing it, but they often say, oh, yeah, Krzyzewski, there's this guy teaching a course in general semantics at Towson State University, which is north of Baltimore, so forth. So it's around. It's part of the impact. I became aware of the impact initially through very informal encounters such as that. Okay. Well, I studied, and I was intending to write a biography of Krzyzewski, which I'm still working on. And this was in the early 1960s. So I wrote to the Institute and told them what my interest was, and I wrote to Kendi, but she sent me to Charlotte, and here we are, 40 years later almost, and still working together. And I took some seminars and so forth, and then eventually became a lecturer at the Institute seminars. In the process of doing that, I made a count today. I've taught in 25 states of the contiguous U.S., and that's a minimum count, because I can't remember where I've been all the time. In Canada, in Ottawa and Montreal, in Poland, Warsaw, Opole, Lublin, Poznan, and Kraków. I've had students from Canada, the United States, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Argentina, England, France, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Holland, Sweden, Poland, Algeria, Ghana, South Africa, India, China, Japan, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Now, all of these people who I ran into at seminars were from these countries, and they paid their way to the seminar. So this is an indication of what my theme is tonight, the impact of Krzyzewski / general semantics at a planetary level. Again, I don't know of any continent that from which orders do not come for general semantics books, particularly Science and Sanity, and from whom I have not met people, again, with the exclusion of Antarctica. I've had some people in seminars who seemed penguin-like, but I would not go so far as to characterize them as penguins. The time is running short, so let me just report to you about my recent experiences in Poland. In 1997, I spent a month in Poland by invitation, and I lectured at two universities, Warsaw and Poznań, at that time. And a man named Professor Jerzy Peltz, who is called by a fellow in Poznań, whose name is Tadeusz Zgubka. Can you say Tadeusz Zgubka? You know that. He calls Peltz the Pope of semiotics, at least in Poland. So I had an interview with Peltz in his office in Warsaw in 1997, as he heard that I was there, and through channels, he set up an appointment. And during that appointment, maybe about halfway through, he said, "Pan pula." Pan used to mean Lord and Sir, but now it mainly means Mr., but still with a little suggestion of the Lord business, especially if it's addressed to me. He said, "Pan pula, it will be very important for you to introduce Krzyzewski to Poland." And I said, "Sir, that is my mission." So we had a nice time. Well, last year, and this year too, it's still 2000, I spent the academic year 1999, 2000. I returned from Poland on July 2nd this year. And I did two main things there, well, three main things. I lectured at 5 universities about Krzyzewski, general semantics, and so forth. And I did research on the Polish half of Krzyzewski's life, on a biography that I'm writing, and I drank vodka. But in that order. My daughters are smiling around because they think that's why I had the bypass operation. They read a lot of pop stuff, you know. Okay. I was very interested to find that although Professor Peltz told me that I should come and introduce Krzyzewski to Poland, even though we both knew that there had been some stuff written about him, you know, in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, perhaps. But we both felt that he really wasn't well enough known in the country from which he came. Well, in my going around in Poland, I found that there was a lot more knowledge of Krzyzewski than I was led to expect. I'll give two examples. In the University of Lublin, my hostess was the Professor Dr. Habilitacja. They love titles there in Poland. I used to call her DRHAB, D-R-H-A-B, you know, it's the abbreviation. Well, she gave me a book in which she had, it was a book about struggle, sometimes warfare, but just struggle in life, competing. Very interesting. And in there, she had a list of people. There was usually about a page or two for each person about what they had to say about struggle in human living. And between Tolstoy and I. M. Bohensky was Alfred Krzyzewski, and of course reference to the bibliography and so forth. Another woman professor in Krakow, Copernicus's alma mater, who was my hostess there, had written a book on the neurolinguistic abuse of children, which was very much informed by Krzyzewskian notions, including bibliographical references to science and sanity, and so forth. So what I found was that the planetary impact, given all of what I've said before, was not only very strong, but seems to be on the uprise. Martha just told me that we got an order from a bookstore in Poznań, which is apparently what the biggest bookstore or distributor in Poland, as far as you know, ordering a bunch of science and sanities and inquiring about other stuff. Now, of course, I'm tempted to attribute that to my recent visit there, but I won't do that. I'll just assume that it's part of the rising interest in the work of this person who is concerned about ameliorating human woe. Since short of being thrown into a concentration camp or zapped with an atomic bomb, most of our problems in life are a function of how we talk to ourselves. Most of our problems don't come from outside. Most of them are sui generis, self-generated. So to learn how we do that so that we can be perhaps kinder to ourselves seems to be a very worthwhile project. Well, what of the future? Tomorrow's colloquium, which I invite you all to attend, will be dealing with that. And the people who will be on the panels are all leaders in teaching and management and so forth who are using general semantics for analysis and for amelioration in their communication systems. I remind you of the mission statement that I read before from the bylaws: to teach, to promulgate, to publish, to assist people who want to learn how to use general semantics in business and education and so forth. We have done that. I say we, I mean we of the Institute. And I want to encourage y'all to recognize that indeed what the mission statement is in the bylaws originating from 1938, since Korzybski's death, the Institute and others have been indeed accomplishing that. We are doing that today. And as positive time-binders, we can persist in doing it for an indefinitely extended series of tomorrows. Thank you. That's enough.